Just a quick reminder that we have a Portuguese channel and also an English channel. So you can choose it. There's a button where you can choose your favorite language. Oh, thank you, Hilary.
Um, yes, like Alonso said, sorry, my computer's being very slow. We have Portuguese and English interpretation today. You can click the interpretation button there at the bottom to access the channel. And then you should pick if you want to be in the English room or the Portuguese room. I would recommend that everybody select English if that is your default language today, just because then you'll be able to hear the English translation of our Portuguese speaker. I think we're at a pretty critical mass here, so why don't we get started? Thank you all for attending, for being here today. Just trying to find my screen. We're excited to be able to have this opportunity to talk about carbon markets today. This is the first of a three-part webinar series for the Climate Justice Resilience Fund in 2025. For those who aren't familiar with CJRF, we are a grant-making initiative working on climate justice and climate adaptation globally. We have a practitioner-led, activist-led board, and we've been exploring shifting power and participatory grant making since 2023. And part of that is recognizing that our board members bring with them a pretty diverse set of experiences and knowledge and interests. And our board members have been interested in exploring some learning topics with our partner community and with our networks for 2025. This is the first of our board-focused webinars this year. We'll have two more later in the year, one on gender and then another on accountability and what it means to be accountable to the communities we're serving. Our board member today who's facilitating this meeting is Panganga Pangawi. I believe she's online. She will be our facilitator. And today's discussion is going to be on carbon markets and exploring carbon markets as a false solution. To get started, I thought I would just launch a quick poll around carbon markets. I think we all have different knowledge and some of us are more familiar with carbon markets than others may be. So I thought we would just do a quick temperature check to see where we're at in the room. So I'm going to launch a poll. And so we just want to understand which of the following statements do you most closely align with? Does your group have programming in support of carbon markets? Does your group actively advocate against carbon markets? Maybe you've heard of carbon markets, but you don't come from a group that has any policy for or against them. Or maybe you're new to carbon markets today, and that's okay. We have a speaker, Thomas Joseph, who's going to give us a really great overview of what carbon markets are. So if you're not familiar with them, I think you're also still in the right room. I see about half of you have responded. Just give it a couple more seconds. Let folks continue. And just ask to please mute yourself when you enter the room. This is a meeting space, not a webinar space, so people have the chance to come off mute. Okay, looks like most of you have responded. Alonso, can people see the results here?
You're supposed to see it.
Hillary, we can see it.
Okay, awesome. So it looks like most of you have 44% have heard of carbon markets, but your group doesn't do anything for or against them. The next majority here is advocating against carbon markets. And then we have people in the room who really do want to learn. Doesn't look like we have anyone in the room today who has programming that actively supports carbon markets. Um, so it looks like that's where we are for our temperature check on understanding it. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Panganga, who is our wonderful facilitator today. She will introduce our panelists and we'll get started. So over to you.
Hi. Wanga atka pangangan ng naka pangawi, wanga ataka aganatama naka Kirsten Nugak Pass, wanga sibunga kami, from the Masinka. We're from the Masinka Nation, and my clan is the Kiwagami, and we live on an island that's between Alaska and Russia. We're actually closer to the Russian shoreline than we are to Alaska. I'm very grateful that folks were able to join today. We have an amazing panel, and I'm actually not wanting to read people's bios. I'm hoping you've had a chance to read them, and I'm going to allow folks to introduce themselves. So the first person that we have is going to be Thomas Joseph. Go ahead and introduce yourself and just dive right in.
Thank you, Pananga. My name is Thomas Joseph. I'm a Hoopa Valley tribal member. Lives in the Six Rivers National Forest, which is located inland from the Redwood Forest and on the west side of the majestic Mount Shasta in Northern California. I am the carbon pricing educator with the Indigenous Environmental Network. Thanks for joining. It's good to be here.
And you're totally welcome to do your 10-minute presentation.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're good. You're good.
Okay. I just know that there's a couple other, like Pananga said, a couple other people that will be speaking that I'm also excited to listen to and hear in. As a member of the Hoopa Valley tribe, I came across carbon markets working in our financial department for our governance of our community. And when I first heard about it, it was concerning, but also like, whoa, that's a lot of money for us being able to set our forest aside. Majority of our land is forested land in Northern California. And so when I was talking to some elders about it, they said that we needed to be a little bit more hesitant and look into it. If it's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true. And so I started diving into it. And my brother, I'm one of 10 children. He's a linguistic specialist for our community. And so I went to him and I asked him, how would you translate this into our own language? And he came back a few days later with this basically document of how to translate this into our own language. But at the end of it, he stated, um, in reality, there is no translation. And I start with this because how he was saying it is like in our ways of being, in our culture, and what it means to be indigenous, we don't think this way. This is not a sustainable way or a sustainable lifestyle, that you can't allow you to receive gain, like monetary gain, with the detriment of other people, with the detriment of other living things, sentient beings, biodiversities, and humans. And so then it really questioned my desire to approve this contract or not, to even dig in further and deeper and to realize that this is a part of a global plan or a global scheme, what have you. And so just to speed this up, I know I only have 10 minutes, but when we start thinking about carbon markets and cap and trade programs, we need to go to the commencement of it, which was started in the Kyoto Protocols when President or Vice President, oh gosh, what was the vice president at that time? Al Gore was leading the charge for climate change, and he wanted to introduce flexible mechanisms into the Kyoto Protocols. Now, flexible mechanisms is just a fancy word for market-based solutions or market solutions. And a lot of the countries at that time didn't want to use a market-based system in order to reduce emissions at source. And so when we're looking at when we're looking at climate change and understanding, even the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, states that we need to reduce emissions at source, that we need to start moving towards in the direction of termination of the fossil fuel, and to keep that greenhouse gases is the main cause of climate change, and that we need to keep them in the ground, and that these flexible mechanisms or these market mechanisms is what they introduced to the Kyoto protocols, which then advanced into the Paris Climate Agreement. And in those programs, what we see is the commodification, the continued commodification of our Mother Earth, and that when you're putting a price tag on carbon, you're continuing to exploit, you're continuing to harm our Mother Earth at the detriment of the people that are most marginalized, which is Indigenous peoples and other peoples of color. When we look at infrastructure of fossil fuel industry, it's usually located in communities of color. And saying that, here in California, in Northern California, we see that these oil refineries are in locations of communities of color, and that by us allowing our forest to be used as an offset for them, they'd be able to expand their fossil fuel, putting our own family, our own cousins in harm's way. I'm sure that all of us are familiar with the raging wildfires of Northern California, or all of California now. And so we've seen that it's not only a detriment to the well-being of humans and of our Mother Earth, but the forest that we actually live in is vital for disruption of these. Sorry, my phone locked up. Of these mechanisms, of these carbon mechanisms. And so when we start thinking about carbon markets, and solutions to climate change, we also have to see what are the root causes of this climate change. We know it's fossil fuel. We know that Indigenous peoples have tenure over 80% of the world's biodiversities. We know that Indigenous people have the longest standing science when it comes to the protection of our Mother Earth, when it comes to understanding the reciprocal relationship that we have with place. And it's these teachings and it's these foundations of science that really need to be lifted up to address climate change. And even if we look at the IPCC report on climate change, we know that that is very much in alignment in the process that we need to go in the reduction of the fossil fuels. And that we shouldn't be using practices that has gotten us in this mess in the first place, like capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and development. And when we look at these root causes of climate change, we're now using these same principles to address climate change. And so we offsets are nothing more than just allowing polluters to pollute. It's allowing the fossil fuel industry to continue business as usual. And when you see those as a concept, as an understanding that this is the systems that we need to move away from, because these are the systems that are causing climate change, we can't actively participate in it. And it's good to see that the question that came up earlier about who's invested in climate change, or who's invested in carbon market or offset programs and who's not. I didn't see anybody that is. Here in California with the California Cap and Trade program, we're starting to see a dependency on these market mechanisms, where part of the funding from the offset projects will be given to environmental organizations, and then they become dependent on this income or this source of revenue for their NGO or for their organizing work. And so we're starting to see that more on a global scale, but definitely here in California. So it's good to see that nobody's participating in that yet. But also as we're moving forward to uplift the people's voices that are most marginalized, we need to understand that we can't participate in mechanisms that put Indigenous peoples in harm's way. That continue to destroy and allow business as usual. And I encourage all of us, I encourage all of you to really see the problems in the creation of these cap and trade and market mechanisms. There's a lot of there's not very much oversight of these projects. These projects seem to continue to be placed on the backs of the people that have caused the least amount of climate change. people of color. And there's additionalities, there's projects that are created that really just undermine the effectiveness of carbon markets, and the projects that may not reduce emissions at source. There's permanence factors which risk reversal due to the events of wildfires and loggings. And so that's one of the concerns that my tribe has. If we were to set this amount of acreage aside for an offset project or a carbon sink, what happens when that land is then burnt due to wildfires? We would then have to be accountable to cough up more of our land to be set aside. And when these lands are set aside, we're seeing that they're not allowing Indigenous people to have access to these lands for traditional cultural reasons, for food, for basket making, and even for just ways of being, especially if you come in from a forest dwelling community. Um, even I recently came across a scenario where windmills were put up as part of an offset project, and now that the tribal community now has to ask permission to access these lands in order to gather their traditional medicines and means. In market programs, we also see leakages, which is emission reduction in areas that might be offset to increase elsewhere. And so there's also measurements and verifications, and inaccurate or fraudulent carbon accounting. And then even if you go inside, those are structures within the carbon market programs. But even if you were to go into the UNFCCC's framing or framework for these types of trading mechanisms like ITMOs, International Trade Mitigation Outcomes, in order for nations to meet their nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Accord, they got to show how they're reducing emissions at source, or show how they're reducing emissions. Most of it's not at source. And they come up with these trading programs. Will, like in California, they'll offset their emissions by buying forested land in Alaska or forested land in the global south. And those countries, if they're participating in the cap and trade or in the UNFCCC program or the Paris Climate Agreement, those can be counted as offset projects for the South. And then when the northern hemisphere buys into those projects or trades with the internationally traded mitigation outcomes, those also can be counted. And so then you see double counting. And so then you're not really reducing emissions or reducing the level of greenhouse gases, because it's being counted more than once. Sometimes it's even being counted more than twice. And so it's really just a fraudulent mechanism to continue business as usual. It's designed by the fossil fuel industry to make sure that will continue to rely on fossil fuels for our permanent methods of energy. And as we see communities continuing to face, especially in Indigenous communities, continuing to face the harms of extraction, it's really putting on the backs of the people that are most marginalized and that didn't cause this mess. And so we have an obligation to not only not participate in these false mechanisms or these false solutions, but to work against them and to educate ourselves and community of why they're not a real solution to climate change. I'll pass it back to you, Pananga.
Thank you so much, Thomas. I've been so grateful to be a part of the Indigenous Environmental Network and to learn from folks like Thomas Joseph. There are many types of offset programs being proposed. We talked a lot about forest offsets, land offsets. Now animals are being proposed as offsets. And so they're wanting to have whales, elephants, lions, tarantulas, bison, caribou, and many other animals that are considered sacred to Indigenous peoples. They're wanting to count them as carbon offsets. The IMF, for instance, is proposing to privatize the migratory paths of whales in order to count them as an offset, because they sequester carbon when they die and they sink to the bottom of the ocean. And one other thing to be mindful of is, Indigenous peoples can't access the land generally when they've signed over land as offsets, but there's usually an exception for mining projects to be able to enter these lands. And when we look at through a lens of intersectionality, there have been many human rights violations, especially against the more gender diverse women, two-spirit peoples are put at risk because the man camps that come in for offset projects bring in folks who further marginalize peoples. And so those are things that I've been able to become aware of while working with the Indigenous Environmental Network. I do want to invite Carol, who is an amazing speaker from Canada. And I'll let you introduce yourself. I'm really excited to hear what you have to say.
Awesome. Thanks, Pananga. And thank you, everyone, and to the team at CJRF. I know there's always a lot of work that goes into coordinating this sort of webinar across multiple time zones. So just thank you for your work there. And thank you to everyone for joining this morning. My name is Carol Manchor. I am Mohawk Wolf Clan from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. We are located in the Grand River watershed in what is colonially known as Southern Ontario. Our homelands actually exist in the Finger Lakes region of what is now called upstate New York. We were forcibly relocated here after the end of the American War for Independence, because our people some of us sided with the British and some with the Americans. So it's interesting as a Haudenosaunee person looking at the political context that we're in right now, and to be a person who's inherited that context. And so in my home community, I'm working with an organization called Protect the Tract, which exercises our sovereignty as Indigenous peoples over our territories. And we are currently in the process of developing our own community-led climate action strategy, as we know that we cannot rely on the entities around us to do so in a good way. And in my professional life, I am the climate leadership lead at Indigenous Climate Action. I've been with the team for about 3 years now. At Indigenous Climate Action, we envision a world of sovereign and healthy Indigenous communities leading climate justice for all. And it's through my work at Indigenous Climate Action that I was introduced to Thomas and some of the team at the Indigenous Environmental Network, who pulled me into a training on carbon pricing about 2 years ago. And once you learn this information, you can't turn your back on it. And so I'm really thankful to the team at IEN and to people like Thomas, to people like Tom Goldtooth at IEN, and my executive director at Indigenous Climate Action, Ariel Deranger, folks who've been really holding the line on this for many years. Again, as Indigenous people, there's a particular harm that comes with this era of carbon markets, and how they harm our communities. And so there's this term that you'll hear for people who come into our communities hawking their carbon markets. People call them carbon cowboys. And they come in with their money and their promises of this net zero future. And a lot of the time, these things, they sound really positive, right? But in a lot of ways, it is the new frontier, right? This is the Wild West right now. And the law that's really being broken when we talk about this is natural law and the rights of nature. And so for us as Indigenous people, forests, lands, oceans, animals, like Pananga was talking about, migratory passive whales, these are not dollar signs. These are a part of creation to us. They have their own agency and spirit, and we exist in relationship to them. As human beings, we depend on the natural world for our survival, not the other way around. And as Haudenosaunee people, we are governed by a set of laws. It's not a municipal code per se, but it's natural law. In the teaching set about in our creation story, in our Guyana Lagoa, our Great Law of Peace, and our many other agreements with other Indigenous nations, with settler nations, we have this blueprint for how we're meant to exist. And as Haudenosaunee people, we're very well known for, we call it the Ganyohanyo, translate somewhat into the words that come before all else, or the Thanksgiving address. And so every time we gather, whether that's, you know, informally in this sort of setting, for ceremonial purposes, for marriages, for funerals, we give thanks to the natural world. And we start with the people, and we move to the smallest blade of grass, medicines, food, the waters, the animals, the sky, the sun and the moon. And so as a Haudenosaunee woman, these are values and beliefs that I abide my life by. These were taught to me. So before I started in the climate justice movement per se, these were beliefs that I had. And so it's these that have allowed me to make those connections as to why we oppose carbon markets. And being a young person, I'm aging out of that category a little bit, but I was born into a climate changed world. I have lived my life in an era marked by climate change. And at the same time, I've witnessed the failures of settler governments to take action at a scale truly needed to address climate change in a meaningful way. What I have instead seen is these carbon markets being pushed forward at every level, including the highest international level through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And so we are now being forced to contend with these false solutions at a time when we desperately need climate action. We desperately need solutions to bring our lives as human beings back in line with nature and in ways that abide by natural law and abide by those beliefs and values that we have. You know, as Indigenous people, we are not a monolith. Our cultures are very different, but there is that consciousness that, like, ecosystems have agency, that we rely on them. That's a sort of continuity across the world. And so when you hear about these, sometimes these carbon markets, they sound positive. They sound like good things, especially when you looking at the legacy of extractive industries. And so I had heard terms like net zero. I had heard about things like carbon capture and storage. And to be perfectly honest, I thought these sounded great. These sounded like positive things to me. And so I always tell people, you know, I oppose these now because I was taught, but it wasn't until I got that information that I was able to change my mind and to change my opinion. And so I always say that, you know, it's you can change your mind when you learn more, and you should. And so, as Thomas said, Indigenous people safeguard 80% of the world's biodiversity. And it is because of our relationships with the lands that we belong to that we are able to do this. And this is because we have fulfilled our original instructions and we have lived in relationship to nature. And so our lands, our homelands, are often targeted for projects like carbon offsets, whether that's through land, forest offsets, oceans, because we have done what we're meant to. So our ecosystems are healthy, they're biodiverse. And so corporations and governments who have participated in destroying those, in breaking natural law, in stealing from the future by investing in projects that destroy the earth, they're now coming to us and they're saying, hey, your lands are healthy, they store carbon, and we want to buy that carbon that's kept in the forest that you have safeguarded so that we can continue to burn coal, so that we can continue to mine and to frack and to put up mega dams. And that's what's really frightening, is that these carbon markets lead to further violations of our rights as Indigenous people, rights that are set out in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And under this guise, a lot of these mechanisms that they use, even at the UN, they have no safeguards or grievance processes. So oftentimes we're not able to oppose them in any kind of meaningful way. And if they do go forward, we're not able to raise concerns to stop them. And again, we know that the health of our people is directly tied to the health of the land. We cannot separate ourselves from our lands. And there's cases already of Indigenous communities in Africa and places like Kenya that have been forcibly evicted from their ancestral lands so that corporations can run a carbon offset program in their territories. And so again, these carbon credits, these carbon offsets, while they might sound positive, what they're really doing is allowing a polluter, whether that's a government or an industry, to emit carbon dioxide above the cap or the limit that they place on themselves. And again, this is not a climate solution. This is not reducing emissions at source. It's playing whack-a-mole essentially with carbon, right? Like I'm going to bang it here and then it'll pop up over here. And it is pseudoscience. In addition to violating Indigenous rights, we are not reducing emissions at source at a time when that is desperately, desperately needed. And so our people have really been holding the line against this on every level, whether that's here in so-called Canada, in stateside. I know we have a relative from the Amazon here, and I'm really excited to hear about him. But our relatives all over the world have been opposing these, sometimes with their lives. And I think particularly as Indigenous people in North America, it's really important for us with the bargaining power that we have with our governments to really hold the line and push the needle forward on opposing false solutions in ways that our relatives in other places cannot. So I think that's all for now. And I will pass back to Pananga.
Got it. Thank you so much. Thank you for bringing up there's a difference between individual human rights and Indigenous rights, which, we recognize as collective rights. And so we have individual human rights that we definitely don't want violated, but often overlooked our Indigenous rights, having our way of being and having our value systems undermined. Those are collective rights, our cosmovision, how we relate to our ecosystems and our animal relatives. Those are all part of who we are as human beings. And to have such a market-based system enter in with our sacred relatives, it hurts Indigenous communities, and it goes against the very foundation of who we are. I'm very, very excited to invite Elvis to speak now. I've heard him speak before, and I'm just so grateful that we have such a powerful panel today. And I don't want to take any more time because I want to give Elvis all the time he needs.
House, sabaw na mama, sabatin matu, berhancak kini kaki matu, agak kebiran hari da cachorro cabinacão. Olá, bom dia a todos. Gratidão a estar participando desse painel, que é muito importante sobre o crédito de carbono. Primeiro, antes de falar, quero saudar aqui todas as pessoas que estão aqui, agradecer a Mãe Terra, agradecer para o tá nos abençoando esse dia. Não sei se vai quebrar protocolo, mas eu gostaria de fazer um canto para que o Sagrado possa nos proteger desse tão importante palestra que a gente está fazendo. Me responde aí se eu posso fazer uma cantoria ou não.
Yes, of course.
Então, peço a vocês, que sinta coração, que vocês fiquem, seu coração que acredita naquilo que você acredita no seu espírito, e peça que a gente possa ter protegido nesse espaço que estamos agora. Yubu mana ibubu, mana ibubu butão, os kawason kaya ui. Kaya 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 Yubu mana ibubu butão Os kawason kaya ui Kaya 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 Trabalho e bubu, e bubu butan, os cawaçam caia oi, kiki. Achei Ralph. Obrigado. E tomando aqui, como eu falei, é muito importante ter esse diálogo, né, de ligações entre. Estou aqui no Brasil, primeiro vou me apresentar aqui para vocês. Eu me chamo Issacar na minha língua, em português sou Elvis. Eu sou do povo Runicuim, Amazônia, Acre, e falar um pouco para vocês, né, o que o crédito carbono está trazendo isso, esse impacto dentro de territórios indígenas. Vou falar mais voltado ao meu povo, que é o povo Runicuim, né? E a gente vê nesses tempos atrás, né, que surgiu. Na verdade, a gente sabe esse assunto há muito tempo, né? Quem fala por nós é o governo, a empresa privadas. Não, tá tudo bem? Em um outro aspecto da energia dessa sociedade é o controle, né, corporativo sobre as... E trazendo esse projeto dentro dos nossos territórios, né, que é impactando nossos territórios, né, enquanto povos indígenas, a gente não tem, né, a gente não tem, né, esse diretamente fazendo, né, fazendo esse consultando os territórios dentro do nosso território, né? Consultando os principais, os lideranças do seu território, né? E muitos lideranças também, né, não sabem muito desses assuntos de crédito de carbono. E muitas empresas privadas, né, na verdade, ano passado para este ano, entraram muitas pessoas dentro do nosso território querendo fazer, né, querendo levar essas falsas soluções, né, falando que vai levar financeiramente, vai ajudar o território, né? Que vai levar melhoria para o território, mas a gente sabe que esse não a gente sabe que esse projeto, esse questão de crédito de carbono não é bom para nós dentro do território, né? A gente vê muito isso, essas pessoas entrando no nosso território, né, levando a fala que muitas das vezes eles vão melhorar, né, questão da saúde, questão das educações, mas sabemos que eles têm um interesse por trás de tudo isso, né? E no nosso território, territórios Unicuim, a gente tem, né, 12 territórios e que tem vários povos indígenas lá dentro, né? A gente vem sendo assediado pelas empresas, próprio governo mesmo, né, ter esse interesse de privatizar o nosso território, né? Controlar nosso território, que a gente não pode fazer mais nada, né? Trazendo isso, né, o impacto de a gente, na verdade, ameaça, né, nossa soberania alimentar, que a gente não pode fazer mais nada no nosso território, né? E esse projeto, né, muitas das vezes a gente ter levado isso nas discussões, na participação nas COP, que quando a gente, né, estamos indo com os lideranças participar, a gente ter levado isso, né, que essas empresas entram, né, para levar essas falsas soluções que a gente que, como eu falei, muitos dos caciques, muitas lideranças não têm esse conhecimento de estar ali conversando e entender um pouco do o que é crédito de carbono, o que é recompensação de crédito de carbono, tá lá dentro. E muitas das vezes, muitas das vezes, algumas lideranças aceita isso e depois vê que não é bom para os territórios, né? E eu trago isso, né? Eu trago mais essa problemática dentro dos nossos territórios, porque ano passado a gente passou por uma questão do nosso território que uma empresa privada entrou no território falando, como teve comentado antes, né, falando que, né, o território precisaria, né, tava trazendo melhoria para o território, né, garantiu todas as questões, mas quando a gente entrou com a ação pela nossa federação, que nós temos federação que representa o nosso povo, né, a gente, né, descobriu tudo, a face da empresa, como que eles queriam trabalhar ali, né, como eu falei, né, privatizando o território, né, impactando que a gente não pode mais mexer no nosso território, porque nós, povos indígenas, a gente vivemos, né, na agricultura tradicional, que a gente planta, né, nossos alimentos, nós vivemos nas caças, né, tradicionais, a gente vive a gente faz os nossos eventos tradicionais, que a gente usa medicina, né? Que é a medicina tradicionais. Então, isso ele impactaria tudo, né? Essa empresa entrando no nosso território, ele trazia, né, um prejuízo para aquela comunidade, para aquele território, né? E é como eu falei nessas COP que a gente teve discussão, a gente levou isso, né, para que né, as pessoas que representam, a maioria das vezes, o governo que representa nós, né, que não tem essa consulta diretamente do território, mas chega nesse espaço da ONU, falando que tem, né, a gente tem a consciência de aceitar esses projetos, né, esses mecanismos dentro do nosso território. Então, isso, para nós, povos indígenas, falando em modo geral, nós, povos indígenas, isso para nós não traz algo positivo para dentro do território. Né? E sabemos que essa questão de crédito carbono só vai trazer o prejuízo para o nosso território. E trazendo né, esse olhar aqui no nosso território, territórios Uniquim, aqui no Acre, e aconteceu essas questões, né? E agora né, a gente está levando o assunto que a gente está começando a compreender, né, como nós representa, né, nós já participamos de alguns COPs, um dos líderes que está mais ativo nas discussões sobre a mudança climática, e nós temos levado nossos territórios, que é o Cacique Ninauá, né, que hoje não que tá, ele para ele estaria aqui, né, comigo, mas ele está na outra atividade, mas a gente tem levado muito isso para o nosso território, para o nosso povo, né, explicando um pouco o que é crédito carbono, né, o que ele pode trazer, qual benefício. Não tem benefício nenhum, as pessoas falam que traz benefício, mas muitas das vezes essas foram soluções que estão no território, né, trazendo só o prejuízo, trazendo né, divisão das comunidades, divisão dos lideranças, né, trazendo desunião dentro da comunidade, né? E acho que é mais basicamente isso, né? Compartilhar um pouco isso com vocês, né? Na questão do território indígena, do nosso território, que é o território Runicuim. Não estou falando de todos os territórios aqui que existem, nós somos vários povos indígenas do Brasil, né? Enquanto vocês falaram também, né? Foi contemplado também na fala do Thomas Joseph, a outra parente aí que também falou. Então, compartilhar mais um pouco, né, desse acontecimento no nosso território, do que a gente vê em questão de crédito carbono, né, dessas empresas privadas e, e próprio governo, né, tá falando aí por nós, trazendo esse questão do crédito carbono dentro do território. Eu vou deixar aqui para a Pananga.
Thank you so much. You all are so amazing. One other thing I wanted to bring into this space is, sometimes these market-based mechanisms bring in other false solutions, such as geoengineering, which can be counted as carbon credits. And now we're also seeing the name cooling credits. I've also seen nutrient credits. We've seen biodiversity credits. And so these are all false solutions. And it's important to keep in mind that market-based systems are subject to boom and bust cycles as well. They're a market. And so people will buy up credits when they're very, very cheap and then sell them off when they're expensive. And thinking about using our lands and our animals, our air in this way is devastating. So I did want to lead us into a Q&A, and I don't have questions that are tailored to specific people. So these are just general, and people can just popcorn in. One of the questions that we often hear is it possible that a very strictly governed carbon market with community safeguards would work to help end the climate crisis? So any of you guys could answer that.
I'll go ahead and take a shot at that. Thank you, Pananga. Also interested in Elvis's and Carol's response as well. Coming from the state of California with the California Cap and Trade Program, it's actually looked at as a prestigious cap and trade program, carbon market program, to be a blueprint, and it's not. First and foremost, carbon markets are not going to end fossil fuel industry. It's not a method to keep emissions in the ground. It's not a method to reduce emissions at source. And so for it to be a climate solution, from the get-go, it is not. That is not how it's designed. That is not the purpose and intent of it. The actual purpose and intent of it is to allow business to continue as usual. Coming from a United States tribal nation that has seen colonization for hundreds of years now, this is exactly what it is. Especially listening to Elvis's testimony about how these policies and these carbon market programs are designed to give tenure to industry over indigenous lands. Indigenous people has had this reciprocal relationship to protect these lands from industry since time immemorial. But now that these carbon market programs allow industry to say you can't enter this forest for your sustainable lifestyle, for your medicines, for your foods, for your ways of being, for your culture, for your prayers, is just like signing treaties all over again. It's just duplicating the process that we've already seen here in the United States, but further on a global scale to continue to hinder indigenous people and to gain access to their unceded territories. And so not only is it not a climate solution, it's a continued colonial practice to benefit the global north and the 1%. So thank you.
Yeah, and just echoing what Thomas was saying, the other thing is carbon markets and a lot of things like carbon capture are not new proposals. They've been around for decades. And so we actually have ways of verifying their efficacy or their proposed efficacy. And it's also important to note that human beings have never actually removed pollutants on any scale. We've only ever shut down the source and then let nature do the rest. So when people sort of talk about safeguards and measures, again, it's pseudoscientific because you can't balance carbon emissions once they've been released through stored sources like fossil fuels. And by doing so, we're still using the same mechanisms that created climate change, and we're reinforcing this idea that capitalism and the market can solve any and all of our problems, even if there's no science behind it, and even if it violates our rights. And so what we really need to be striving for is to leave fossil fuels in the ground, to end fossil fuel subsidies, and to stop burning fossil fuels. We can talk about the rest in a couple decades, but at this point, we should be driving to end fossil fuel subsidies and stop emissions at source. I don't know if Elvis has anything to chime in on.
Pô, tava com o microfone ligado aqui. Então, como o Joseph falou, a outra moça também falou, isso é importante. Eu tenho falado muito, né? Nós, povos indígenas, a gente acho que nós não podemos, né, ir nesse rumo de capitalismo, de querer, né, colocar o crédito de carbono, esse projeto de crédito de carbono, né? Nós, povos, enquanto povos indígenas, a gente não precisa de dinheiro para proteger a floresta, a gente não precisa de nada para fazer proteção. Nossa proteção veio da nossa ancestralidade, do nosso passado, né? E isso traz muitas reflexões para as pessoas que estão aí, né, nesse mercado. Tem muitos parentes também que são envolvidos, né, em questão de trabalhar crédito de carbono. E nós ter colocado muito isso, né, a gente, nessa questão, né, essa valorização da nossa floresta dentro dos nossos territórios, né, o nosso direito dentro dos nossos territórios. Então, isso seria importante a gente refletir isso, de não aceitar, né, essa compensação, esse possível de a gente trabalhar com crédito de carbono. E também, se for possível trabalhar, mas a gente seja, né, consultado diretamente com todas as lideranças, seja consultado nossas organizações, que a gente possa, né, de agregar o nosso conhecimento tradicionais dentro do nosso território.
Thank you so much. One other, or I have about 3 more questions, and then I'm going to throw it to folks in the chat. So there's many communities who are approached for providing offsets are Global South communities who face poverty and many other social disparities. This puts them into an extremely vulnerable position, and oftentimes communities don't feel like they have a choice. What advice or words of hope do you have for these communities?
Thomas, you want to take it?
Go ahead. I can follow, Carol.
Yeah, I think that is important to contend with. And I also saw someone in the chat said, as Indigenous people, we should be proactive instead of reactive. And that is all important to contend with. Especially, again, like you said, our communities are systematically impoverished. We have not been allowed to develop our nations and our communities according to our values. And this does seem like an opportunity to have the funds to do so. And so again, I am not cultural authority. Even in my own community, we have our hereditary leadership, our hereditary governance who makes those choices. And so I think within any Indigenous community, if that is the case and you are up against, multi-million-dollar corporations, I think that is a choice and people have the agency to do so. And again, I think to do that, knowing your rights, your inherent rights as Indigenous people, knowing your rights is set out in UNDRIP and the principles of free, prior, and informed consent. And I think also ensuring that you have access to those lands, that you will not be evicted from them, as well as measures on just safeguards and grievances, taking all of that into account onto whether or not you choose to take part in that. Ultimately, that is up to the individual communities and their rights and rights holders. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to chime in on, Thomas or Elvis.
Thank you, Carol. So our chairman at one time told me, Thomas, we didn't create this mess. We did not start climate change. We didn't do this. This is done by them, whoever he thinks them is, main society, I guess. And so he wanted to move forward to be able to accept these dollars for allowing our forest to be used as a carbon sink, but our community refused it. And so what I strive to do is encourage Indigenous peoples on a global scale, but especially here in the United States, when we're in the heart of the belly of the beast it is, that we need to stand firm on what it means to be Indigenous and the values and the cultural teachings that we hold dear and our ancestral knowledge that still runs through our veins, and acknowledge the importance of our reciprocal relationship with our Mother Earth. And that this short period of time that we've experienced through colonization, these last 200 to 400 years, depending on where you are, is just a short period of time, considering to our existence with place and where we come from, and that this is not just an Indigenous issue. That this is a human rights issue. This is an Indigenous rights issue. But more importantly, as a human, we must understand that climate change is real and that we need real solutions to move forward. We can't be using these market mechanisms to allow us to address a climate change, but which only prolongs the fossil fuel industry, which only allows them to continue to put our families, our communities, and our ways of life at risk. When you look at Indigenous communities, you see that they have a struggle of loss of language. That when we prioritize the Indigenous language, that doesn't only benefit Indigenous people and that tribe. It benefits all of humanity, because in that language is the keys to a reciprocal relationship with our Mother Earth, is the keys to real climate solutions. And so, we must also, especially here in the States again, understand the importance of honoring our treaties. And I don't say that as like our treaties as Indigenous peoples. Our communities made those treaties with your communities. Those are your treaties. You have an obligation and a trust responsibility to abide by those rights and those guarantees that you promised. Now, if those treaties were met and agreed upon, and that's how it was, the law of the land, the way it should be, our communities wouldn't be pushed into these communities that are easy to pry on from industry. We wouldn't be impoverished. We wouldn't have a housing crisis. We wouldn't have a healthcare crisis. We wouldn't have an education crisis. These, because our communities are pushed to be in this impoverished state, it makes it really easy for a corporation to step in and promise additionalities of like, we'll address your healthcare issue, we'll address your housing. We've heard this before, you've promised that before, but now you want us to sign a 99-year carbon market contract with industry that has very little to no oversight of the public community. When we signed a contract with your government and your government fails at these treaties, we're not going to allow industry to continue to treat us the way the US government did. Things must change. We need a systematic change to address climate change. Thank you.
Elvis, did you want to respond to that one? You don't have to, but if you
Eu
want
ia
to.
falar, o Thomas Joseph já praticamente comentou. Eu tô bem falado.
Perfect. I'm going to do one more and then we're going to throw it to the chat because there's quite a few questions. So we've heard a lot about how a community directly participating in a carbon market can be harmful to that community. Can you explain how, when a community chooses to participate, how that harms other communities, like outside of their community?
I'm going to go ahead and shoot at this one, Carol and Elvis, because this is what's dear to me. This is how our community decided to stand against fossil fuel industry. Within the United States, we had what we called the Indian Relocation Act, which is kind of what we're seeing right now. When we're seeing, but we're seeing a removal of people from their community by force. And with the Indian Relocation Act, that's what we witnessed. It wasn't just women and children. It was our teachers, it was our doctors, it was our spiritual leaders, and they were taken from our communities and put into the inner city to be used as a workforce. And so when they were moved to the inner cities, they lived in impoverished states, and that's where industry was located. So in California, there's a refinery in Richmond. And so if we were to offset the refinery in Richland and allow them to continue to pollute as usual, or even expand their pollutants, those communities experience a higher rate of cancer, a higher rate of asthma, a lower life expectancy. And so when we allow or participate in offset projects, we are allowing the harm to be done elsewhere, and most likely other communities of color. Carol put it as a very artistic way of a whack-a-mole. You're not reducing the carbon at source. You're just switching the blame or switching the responsibility elsewhere. And on a global scale, the pollutants that are released in California is not being absorbed by the forest of Amazon, nor is it their responsibility. California likes to pride themselves as the fifth largest economy in the world. They also hold the fifth largest responsibility to climate change. It is their responsibility to reduce emissions at source, not on the backs of the people from the Amazon in Elvis's community, and restrict his ability to live life in the means that they were supposed to live their lives, to continue the reciprocal relationship with Mother Earth, to protect the sacredness of their communities.
Again, just obviously agreeing with what everything Thomas says, but I think again, when as Indigenous people, if you go forward with a project, you're just granting legitimacy to it, and you're setting a precedent. So these corporations can say, oh, well, this community and this community and this community have done it, and we've given them X amount of money, and so you should too. And so by participating in them, you just grant them legitimacy. And I think even just in the answer that I gave and hearing Thomas and Elvis, I think we are so often made to be economic hostages to these systems. You'll kind of hear the same discussion and arguments in why a fossil fuel project should go forth in an Indigenous community. Well, it'll give you jobs, you'll get money from it. And it's, again, like, this is sort of the new frontier of that, of this justification of, well, it's going to happen anyway, so we might as well make some money from it. And again, I think like what Thomas said is our values are worth more to us than money. There is no dollar value that you could ever assign to our homelands and to creation. And, you know, if you go ahead and do that, you just participate in that system even further and you extend the lifespan even further. And so I think, again, building a global Indigenous peoples movement with a really strong stance against this and being really unified in it is the way to bring about the kind of change that we want to see, especially in communities in the global north who our countries will often take part in systems under the UNFCCC where a country can implement a green energy project in a country in the global south and then gain carbon credits from that. They can gain things like emissions reductions units, or like they're called like certified units. And so again, in the global north, we benefit from the continued exploitation of our relatives in the global south. And so we need to be building a really coherent, unified movement against that. Check.
Bom, como eu falei de novo, o Tom Joseph abordou muitos assuntos, mas eu acho que é isso que eu estava comentando sobre essa questão, né? Tipo, a gente passou isso para o território, né? Essa questão de as pessoas chegarem e falar que estão trazendo benefício para o território, né? Está trazendo algo que tipo, em questão de saúde, em questão de educação, e sabemos que nosso território é um território preservado, mas politicamente a gente está passando por uma questão de território que precisamos e fazer estrutura dentro do nosso território. Educação, saúde é muito precário dentro do nosso território, povo nicuim. E como o Thomas comentou, no nosso território não tem valor. A gente não precisa colocar valor no nosso território para que eles possam, né, fazer, né, todo esse estrago de novo dentro do nosso território. Então, coloco isso para nós que todo, né, a palavra que foi dita aqui, concordo todos, né, que a gente possa continuar lutando em questão de a gente preservar o nosso território, né, a gente, né, ter essa segurança dentro do nosso território, não aceitar nessas empresas, próprio mesmo governo, né, assediado o território indígena, né, onde eles querem só lucrar, onde eles querem só financeiramente para eles, não para o território, diretamente para o território indígena.
Thank you so much. There are many, many questions in the chat. So the first one that we saw was, have any of their models worked, and why not, as Indigenous peoples, we take a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach? Carbon markets are not going away. And maybe I'll read one more and you guys can pop off. Will carbon trading through restoration of forests or plantations have a positive impact?
I'm going to go ahead and shoot at it real quick, guys, and give space. You know, when we think of positive impacts or restoration of forest, we got to, you know, it sounds good, but what we're seeing is the introduction of invasive species for the reintroduction of this forest. In Peru, I was down there last November, where they put in eucalyptus trees from Australia to sequester their carbon. You know, we're seeing that on a global scale, and the destruction of the Amazon to put these trees up because they grow faster and they can chop them down quicker to be used as for other means, whether it be lumber or incinerating for energy. And so we're also seeing that these projects also promote deforestation. Like even though they say that they don't, they have it implemented in the contract as forest management, which is the continued deforestation of these forests under the disguise of cap and trade or carbon market programs. And I wanted to also state the importance of kind of going to a question beforehand is, you know, we see tribes that engage in carbon markets or engage in cap and trade programs under the disguise of economic sovereignty, that they have a sovereign right to engage in these mechanisms. But we must not neglect the fact that with sovereignty comes a responsibility and accountability. We need to be responsible for the tenure that we have it with place and accountable for generations to come. And so, you know, it is a global problem. climate change is a global issue. And so it is going to take all of us, especially Indigenous nations, that have tenure over 80% of the world's biodiversity, that if they did not engage in carbon market programs, it would not work. Here in the United States, Indigenous people have tenure over 40% of the fossil fuel industry. If we did not engage in fossil fuel abstraction, it would not work. It would fall within. So, it is a fight within, but it is a struggle that we all need to engage with.
Yeah, I think this is something I have heard a lot. Even I attended COP28 in Dubai in 2023, and you hear this a lot even within the Indigenous Peoples Caucus, and I think it's something I have my principled answer to, and I think it looks different in reality, where people say, well, these aren't going away, and it's interesting to me. Within, for those who maybe aren't familiar with climate negotiations, Article 6 in the Paris Agreement has been, discussed for going on 10 years now. So it seems like even the negotiators themselves don't know what it is, what it looks like, and how to actually implement it. And in those 10 years, emissions have continued to rise. Indigenous people, again, have been had to contend with colonial violence being inflicted on us and these false solutions being pushed forward. And so if there was actually 10 years of meaningful climate action, to think of what that would look like. And so I also find it sometimes troubling when we're trying to contend with the world that we want to build, the world that we deserve, when people, begin with, well, this isn't going away. I believe when I envision the future, I don't want to stay with what isn't possible, because we don't know what's possible, right? We're pushing for a world, and we don't know what that looks like. And so I think holding that line in the meantime is important. I'm curious, Elvis, what you think on that as well.
Na COP16, eu ter falado sobre as questões no Brasil tem o eucalipto, que a Ana acabou de comentar nos comentários aí que eu vi. Então, essa questão, né, de trazer, né, impacto, né, no Brasil, né, eu acho que são 9 espécies de eucaliptos diferentes plantadas, que traz esse impacto, né, eles estão falando que estão trazendo algo benefício, mas eles trazem algo que é que prejudica muito outras plantas, né? Sabemos que eucalipto para aqui para o Brasil, no nosso aqui na região do Acre não tem, mas tem na outras regiões do Brasil, né? E ter falado isso na COP do Cali, né? Ter comentado isso no painel que eu fui participar, né? Pessoas falando que estava trazendo benefício, mas para o Brasil, né? Praticamente para onde está sendo, né, plantado, para sendo onde está sendo levado, não está sendo um impacto muito boa dentro dos territórios, né? Se trazer isso para os nossos territórios, né, claro que vai prejudicar isso bastante para outras plantas, né, dentro do nosso território. Então, acho que é esse comentário que eu posso contribuir.
Thank you so much. If carbon markets are considered a false solution, what are concrete recommendations for developing countries like Indonesia to ensure a just energy transition without falling into the trap of carbon schemes? And how should governments, especially Global South, navigate the pressure from carbon market advocates?
I do think this would be a good one for Elvis to lead, actually.
Vou jogar no Jostão.
Thank you, Elvis.
Fala, Tom.
Again, I think that, again, being from the global north, being from a place like especially so-called Canada, we have to contend with this image that Canada has on an international stage, where they're really seen as being very sympathetic to Indigenous peoples. They're seen as being climate leaders. And something, maybe for those who don't know, is our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau recently stepped down as Prime Minister, as leader of the Liberal Party, and they have appointed and elected Mark Carney, who is an economist who actually has chaired a lot of these carbon market organizations on a global scale. So I think that's something that I'm keeping in mind of what that means for our political situation here in Canada, of having a carbon cowboy as our prime minister now. And it also troubles me in the context of the UN, where countries in the global north are encouraged to implement green energy projects in the global south to earn credits for. So again, I think in the global south, where they have been robbed in the name of capital, have been exploited for centuries at this point, for those of us in the global north to live the lives that we do, to again have that stance on ending fossil fuel subsidies and transitioning to renewable energy, and taking the money from fossil fuel subsidies and investing in renewables, because this conversation is so often focused on the global north. For people in the global south to be able to have that stance of climate action cannot be made at the expense of us and our people and our communities. And for us in the global north to, again, really push that needle forward on what's possible, and ensuring that we are not sacrificing our relatives to capital to benefit from temporarily. A lot of these questions on successful projects are, maybe there's success in the terms of money. You got some money and now you get to drive nicer trucks and, have nicer homes, but those impacts are still being faced. You're still dealing with extraction. You're still dealing with colonialism. So again, I think just maintaining that stance for us in the global north, and for people in the global south to really hold steadfast to not being exploited, and creating that narrative, right? That global Indigenous peoples movement, where we stand unified in our common responsibilities, but they're different, which was something that was axed out of the Kyoto Protocol. So transitioning back into that mindset. But I'm curious, Thomas or Elvis, what you have to say.
No, Carol, that's spot on, and to think about it on that global scale, including Indonesia and the global south, they did not cause this problem. Just like Indigenous people, like my chairman was saying, did not cause this problem. The problem and responsibility relies on the global north. We have caused this issue, especially the United States. We are the number one polluters. We are the number one producers of fossil fuels. This is an issue that we need to address, and to hold our own country accountable to the processes of getting to climate change at scale. We need to. The best thing that Indonesia can do is to hold the global north accountable, to make sure that the money that is coming down to address climate issues and climate needs is there. That these accounts that are being created to address the emergencies of climate change are being funded by the global north. This destruction has been done by us. And we need to be held accountable in that UN space. We see a lot of nations falling to the demands of the United States. And now that the United States has pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, hopefully they'll have less influence in that space. But we need to make sure that a just transition not only acknowledges the stepping away from fossil fuels, but it also acknowledges the social injustices that our communities suffer because of these corporate schemes, because of industry stepping into our communities and causing the divide of wealth disparities. So a just transition also needs to address those factors as well. And a just transition needs to be taking steps away from the fossil fuel industry, and not to create another industry in its place that's going to continue to rage havoc on the most marginalized communities. But again, the global south needs to unite and stand against the global north and hold the global north accountable for the atrocities of climate change. Over to you, Elvis.
Bora lá. Então, isso é importante essa aliança do Sul Global, né, em questão de mercado de carbono. Eu acho que o país, né, Sul Global deve ser juntamente, né, tá atuando essas negociações, né, onde a gente participa, para que podemos, né, esse mecanismo de não só depender de prestação de crédito de carbono dentro do território, né, e acho que é uma das alternativas de trazer exploração alternativa como tributação de emissões de nova forma de financiamento climático, né, prometendo soberania territorial e ambiental, né, e eu trago muito isso essa pressão dos defensores do mercado de carbono, né, especialmente os países ricos, né? Grandemente, né, essas corporações, pode ser, né, intensamente, né, os governos do Sul Global, né, devem, né, fortalecer suas políticas climáticas internas, né? E estabelecendo, né, esse regulatórios de sólidos, né, priorizar soluções beneficiariamente diretamente suas populações, né, em ecossistema que não depende só em questão de crédito de carbono, né? E eu acho que, reforçando aqui, né, de colocar, reconhecer o direito, né, dos povos ali, né, acho que eu coloco mais praticamente isso.
Thank you, guys. We have time probably for one or two more. In our Bangladesh Indigenous community, people are very poor, and how will they participate in carbon reduced market? I'm really happy for this question. It's a really, really tough question. People are extremely impoverished in some of our communities, and it's not necessarily about it's not like the difference between, having nicer cars and nicer homes. For some of these communities, it's a matter of life and death, or like people don't have things to eat, and that's just the reality. And I know that this question comes up a lot, so thank you for asking.
I'll give it a shot, but it's kind of like just kind of lifting up some talking points that I already spoke to. Again, this climate crisis that we're stepping into, this climate chaos that we're about to foresee, has not been done by our communities. And the responsibility really does lie in the hands of the elite in the global north. They need to be held accountable to these atrocities. And when we participate in these mechanisms that just continue the destruction of our Mother Earth, we will be the first ones to experience that. We as people of color, as impoverished people, as indigenous people, we will see that first and foremost. And so, can we willingly participate in our own demise? Another thing that we need to consider is we may be poor when it comes to, and I also want to recognize the privilege of this statement that I'm about to say. I am coming from the global north. I am coming from the belly of the beast. And so the poverty that I see may not be to the level of other parts of the world, but we do here in California have extreme poverty with homelessness and everything else. But saying that, I also see that the love and the compassion that we have in community far exceeds the monetary gain, and that participating in our own demise is just that. It is our own demise. And to acknowledge the fact that these carbon markets are a further reach into our own sovereignty, our own ways of being, our own culture. And are you willing to exchange that? Are you willing to participate in something that will deny you access to your lands, that will deny you access to your sovereignty and to your ways of being? That is a communal question. That is something that your community needs to decide on. But it doesn't mean it's easy, and it doesn't mean that it's a simple task. But Chet.
I'd like to respond also, if that's okay, you guys. So, what we see with carbon markets and carbon brokers is the same pattern as we've seen in industry, in extractive industry. We see the same promises that we're going to get jobs, that we're going to get funding, and then what we see is really people outside of our communities have the most benefit, and we actually don't see any economic we don't see any economic benefit from that. That's what we experience in our community in Alaska. But we also recognize that there is a parallel between how healthy the land is and how healthy our communities are. And to me, the promise to participate in something like the carbon market or participate in extractive industry, those are false hopes for our community because we're only ever going to be as healthy as the earth is. And if we participate in a system that harms the earth, it continues the harm of earth. Carbon markets have actually shown to increase emissions. It does not reduce emissions, it increases emissions because it allows people to write off those emissions as if they hadn't happened, but they have. And so we are only going to be as healthy and well as the earth as Indigenous peoples, and just keep that in mind.
Definitely agreeing with the two of you. And I think in 2025, in this moment that we're in, the wealth gap between the working class and those who own the means of production has never been larger. The fact that you have the richest man on earth colluding with the dismantling of American democracy right now, I think just drives this point home of who really gets to benefit from this. It's not our people, it's not our community. And it also is really crystal clear to me that these corporations, these governments actually have no desire currently to reduce emissions at source. And by participating in these, they see it again as another opportunity to make money at a point of crisis. And so in the context of global poverty, even as a working class person, in the global north, I do have a level of privilege especially in the work that I do. I am privileged to do so. I do know that many people are living in a level of poverty that's unthinkable. And so it is hard to say, if these corporations come in and they're offering money, not to take it, when that could, dramatically increase your quality of life and your material conditions, in the short term, to feed your family when you're coming up against these choices that seem impossible to make. And I do think, though, that resistance against insurmountable odds is part of the human spirit, it's part of the human soul, if that's what you believe in. And resisting against those and pushing back is really important in this time, where the again, like that wealth gap is unthinkable to think of how much $1 billion is, right? And who is interested in these? It's not our people. The world's richest men are the ones that are pushing a lot of these forward and have shifted the negotiations and have co-opted them. So again, I think there's never an easy answer to that, especially coming from the global north, and knowing the reality of so many people's lives. But it's an interesting time to exist and to be a human being, and pushing back on this is part of the human spirit.
Elvis?
Olá. Então, como foi todo esse comentário, acho que eu trago isso voltado para o Brasil mesmo, né, para os territórios indígenas. E isso foi comentado agorinha, né, para a moça aí, é tipo, muitas das vezes, né, a gente não sabe qual é a situação dos territórios, né, é como ela falou, né, as pessoas vão há 6 dias falando, né, compra alguns lideranças, né, falando que vai tá esse tanto de valores, né? Tem isso, né? Muitas das vezes pessoas caem por questão pessoal, né? Que quer se beneficiar, não pensa, em modo geral, das comunidades, né? Dos territórios. Então, isso é uma da situação também que é muito crítica dentro do território, né? E eu trago isso por ter passado, né? Algumas situações nos territórios, né? Que as pessoas vão, né? E aceita esse tipo de projetos dentro do território por questão pessoal, né, questão financeira, né, e isso é uma da situação que, né, tem acontecido muito com as empresas privadas que chega nos territórios garantindo, né, prometendo várias coisas, né, para as pessoas que estão ali, né, e acho que é isso, né? Comentar isso um pouco, tudo que vocês falaram, né, que eu estou aqui captando. Obrigado.
Thank you, guys. I think we should save a little bit of time for our breakout sessions. Hillary, did you want to take the logistics on that one?
Yeah, we thought it'd be nice to just have a chance to do some smaller group discussions around this topic. So we've put everyone in breakout groups. I have put the questions here in the chat. What false solutions does your group advocate against? And then in what ways can communities support themselves while fighting false solutions? And how can we support one another? We'll only have about 15-ish minutes in the breakout groups. And then we just ask you come back into the main space, and we'll have about 10 minutes to have final plenary discussion where you can share if there's anything really meaningful that came out of your breakout groups. So I'm going to open up the groups and yeah, take it from there. We're starting to filter back in from the breakouts. Here the group comes. I hope that you had productive conversations in the small groups. I know there's never enough time for this sort of one-on-one or small group discussions, but I will pass it back to Panganga, who's going to facilitate kind of a short report back from the breakouts.
How many groups did we have?
We had 8, I think.
Does anybody want to feedback?
Group 9.
We had
Sorry.
9. We had 9.
I'll just take volunteers to feedback. Everybody's like, no.
Well, I'm happy to do a quick start from the group I was in.
Sure.
We just, briefly talked about kind of like false solutions, but there's an article in The Guardian today that compared geoengineering, which is kind of like the hot, trendy current false solution that's out there. They compared it to treating cancer with an aspirin, and just that kind of resonated as something, like it's a really good way to put false solutions for the climate crisis in the way that they're not treating the underlying issue, they're not treating they're not responding to us. They're not really treating the system. They're just putting like a Band-Aid, a quick fix. And in a lot of cases, they're not even going to be a real fix or a Band-Aid. They're going to cause more harm. Carol was in my breakout group and gave an example of how some geoengineering in the East Coast of the United States has been causing worse climate impacts in places like Europe. So that was, really quick from our
So too. I felt it. Great. My child just woke up. Sorry. So our group was great. We had, a variety of folks who are frontline community and, funder, and we. It was good to look at the different ways we interpreted the questions. I think that second question's a little tricky when we think about support. Sometimes we think about monetary support. For me, I think the spiritual support is much more. That's what I need more than anything, because these kinds of fights can be really challenging. But it's it's beautiful when we're able to have a discussion and learn from each other. And I did get to learn from our two folks. I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to call people out. Thomas.
Oh, yeah, I'll go ahead and share. I had a small little group, and two of the main questions or points that came up was, can we participate in this when we're coming from communities that are more impoverished, and I think just want to reiterate the point that Pananga made about the what we call here in the States the Reagan trickle down effect, that these monies never show up in the hands of the communities that it needs to be in. It's eaten up by the carbon cowboys that Carol was mentioning earlier. It's eaten up by bank systems and loan officers. There was a recent story from a Colombian that said that they received their first payment of a carbon market contract 25 years into the contract. It's a 99-year contract, and each household received $25, not per person, but per house. They were restricted from this forest for 25 years, able to sustain their lifestyle as forest dwelling indigenous peoples, receive their medicines, their foods, their customs, and they receive this pittance of after they've been removed from this forest for 25 years. Of course, they were mad, and that's another story to go into later. Another point that came up is, we're moving into COP30. It's been 30 years that these nations have come together underneath the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. How come they're still pushing forward these carbon markets? Well, last year, COP29, carbon markets out of the Paris Climate Agreement was finally ratified. And so, I believe it was 2000, Carol probably correct me if I'm wrong, 2015, when the Paris Climate Agreement was passed. Almost 10 years later, the flexible mechanisms, or the carbon mechanisms, carbon markets, was finally ratified. That is on purpose, with intent, to allow that these carbon brokers to push this industry onto indigenous peoples without free, prior, and informed consent, because most of the times the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples is not fulfilled, and so it is with it. It is with intent that it was recently ratified, and that we also have to acknowledge that carbon policy is being written by the fossil fuel industry. When you attend these UNFCCC spaces, it is mostly influenced by the fossil fuel industry. They have the largest delegation there. They spend the most money in lobbying there, and we can really see how that takes fruit here in the United States when we have a billionaire that's not even a United States citizen dictating the direction of our country from within the Oval Office, who is not even an elected representative nor a citizen from our country. Not that citizenship really matters, but just kind of acknowledging that this guy is also doing a corporate takeover of the United States, much like carbon policy within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. It is an intent why they're not addressing these carbon markets. So those were the two things in our group. Check.
Just popcorn up. Anybody else?
Posso eu? Então, o nosso grupo foi bem pequeno mesmo, só foi eu e outra colega que está presente, a Ana, agradecer ela aí pela ter participação, né? Então, a gente conversou um pouco, né, das duas perguntas. No nosso grupo, a gente tem acompanhado, né, já há alguns tempos nessas discussões nas COPs, né, junto, eu como um jovem que está participando, né, ativamente, levando essa voz da juventude para nessas discussões, junto com o Cacique Ninauá e outras pessoas, né, mulher liderança que também estão participando, a gente ter, né, olhado muito e trazer essas informações para dentro do nosso território, né, para que as pessoas também possam, né, entender um pouco dessa o que a gente acompanha lá fora, né, o que a gente leva isso para nessas discussões. E a gente está trabalhando, né, com a gente está trabalhando com formação, né, trazer isso na nossa formação, na nossa linguagem, né, na nossa língua materna, né. Muitas das pessoas também não entende algumas, né, palavras tipo da ONU, né, e a gente já tem dificuldade de entender o processo ali dentro desses espaços, né, o que é, né, a palavra que é de carbono, né, os mais velhos que não falam português, né, que não entende, né, muitas palavras que a gente fala, eu, né, já tenho adaptei essa linguagem de não indígena, eu entendo um pouco das situações, né, discussões, mas muito dos nossos velhos, nossos pajés, não, né, que a gente mudou do pajé, que é na Ibaiana, na minha língua, que é os conhecedores, sabedores, né, do nosso tradição, na nossa cultura, né, a gente está levando isso para que a gente possa fazer formação na nossa língua, de fazer eles entender, né, muitas pessoas entrarem, né, falar dessas situações, para que as pessoas, né, tenham essa resposta, né, e ajudar também outros territórios, né, perto, né, nosso território nós somos 12 territórios, mas são territórios grandes, né, e muitas das vezes as pessoas olham assim de querer assediar, querer tentar nessas situações, né, e estamos, né, nesse olhar de fazer formações na nossa linguagem de algumas línguas que são mais importantes de ser falado nas outras, né, questões. Então, a gente conversou isso com a Ana, né, ela colaborou também de ter falado algumas coisas aí, foi muito importante a gente fazer esse diálogo, né, e ter compartilhado com ela, né, em questão dessa formação que a gente está preparando, né, para a COP30, né, de colocar também que é importante a gente fazer essas formações, porque esse ano o COP vai ser aqui no Brasil, né, e nós estamos querendo, né, se preparando para levar as lideranças que são realmente da base, né, que são diretamente impactadas com essas situações, para que eles possam levar isso, né, para essas, né, esses grandes empresários aí que não estão nem aí, que só querem, né, lucrar, só querem ganhar em cima de todas as situações, né, e a gente estamos preparando para que essa possa ser possível de participação de maioria da liderança, das mulheres, juventude, levar essa voz, né, de a gente estar presente vamos dizer, desse COP para mim não funciona. Pessoas falam assim que fala tanto mudança climática que a gente nunca viu de mudar alguma coisa que a gente está vivendo hoje, né? Principalmente aqui no Brasil, Amazonas, a gente ano passado e esse ano também a gente está sendo impactado já de queimadas, de enchentes, né? De seca. Agora, nesse tempo agora, está começando já a encher os rios, né? Nascentes e está impactando já os territórios indígenas. E daqui a pouco a gente não sabe como é que vai estar, né? E cada vez está piorando, né? E a Mãe Terra tá aí pedindo socorro. E isso quem vai fazer é nós povos indígenas que está ali, né, protegendo. Nós não fazemos igual como Thomas José falou, né? Nós não fizemos poluição, nós não estamos aí para destruir, a gente sempre protegeu. Mas essa poluição, essas destruições vêm dos grandes empresas. As pessoas que estão destruindo em outros países estão investindo aqui no Brasil. E isso não está funcionando nada. Eles estão investindo aqui para. Depois estão falando que estão investindo aqui no Brasil, mas o que eles estão fazendo lá no país dele? O que eles estão fazendo lá onde estão empreendendo essas grandes empresas? Né? E ficar essa reflexão para nós, enquanto povo indígena, a gente sempre vai estar protegendo, a gente vai sempre estar, né, ligação com a natureza, ligação com a espiritualidade, ligação com a nossa medicina tradicionais, e a gente vai estar sempre fortalecendo para que a gente possa, né, é, ver o mundo mais verde, né? Essa conscientização de seres humanos, de pessoas aí que estão ativas, que a gente possa estar trazendo isso enquanto nós, né, o povo indígena está vivo, a gente vai sempre estar batalhando para a proteção da nossa floresta. Xavá, xavá, house, house.
Thank you so much, Elvis. Carol, did you have a group?
I was with Hillary, and so our other group member, Amelia, was speaking about some of her PhD research on this. And something that I thought was interesting was she had noted that the term false solution is not one that pops up in the literature as of yet. So I think coming out of the grassroots, it'll be interesting to see how that gets pushed forward and is reflected in academia as well. But that was mainly it, and Hillary shared as well.
Did anybody else have any like juicy bits from their group that they wanted to share, or even any last minute thoughts as we wrap up?
I think maybe I can share from our group. What we realized is that we didn't necessarily have the direct experience within the communities, but like I'm coming from Green Grads Fund, we support communities working on this. And one thing that resonated with all of us is we are taken back to when colonization happened and how communities, because of poverty or being told that they were not civilized and being offered things like sugar, and or they then saw their countries being taken away from them. And so how do we couch that narrative in a way that people understand? So we're talking about consciousness raising, as Elvis was talking about. We're talking about consciousness raising. Our people need to know, they need to understand what carbon credits are. If people who are educated, who have been doing this work, don't even seem to really understand the terminology and what impacts that has. Imagine the people that are in the communities and are facing, such dreadful levels of poverty. So people need to be informed to understand what this is about, and again decolonize the way that we are currently being given and being sold this false solution.
Thanks so much. I actually have a publication I'm going to drop in the chat just in a couple of minutes. I hope we have time before we all sign off. That kind of gets into that.
While Panaga's putting the link in the chat, I just want to thank everyone for attending today. This was, as I mentioned, the first in a 3-part CGRF board-driven webinar series. Our next one on gender will be before summer, so probably around April or May, and then we'll have one in the fall on accountability. I want to say a really big thank you to Carol, Thomas Joseph, and Elvis. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your contributions, and a big thank you to our board member Panganga, who was a great facilitator. Thank you all so much for being here today.